A minerals and investment deal between the US and Ukraine hailed by both sides as a diplomatic victory and a decisive step towards ending 3 years of war with Russia. And for more on that minerals deal, we're joined by Scott Lucas. He's Professor of International Politics at University College Dublin. He's speaking to us from Wicklow in Ireland. Professor Lucas, a diplomatic win, at least that's what they're calling it, for both the US and Ukraine. But for the players, the main players within the Trump administration, would this also be considered a win-win?
It depends on which part of the Trump administration you talk to. There is one faction within the Trump administration. This includes the Vice President, J.D. Vance. It includes the senior advisor, Stephen Miller. It includes the envoy to Russia, Stephen Witkoff, who want nothing to do not only with Ukrainian security, but really with European security. They want the U.S. to walk away. But there's another faction within the Trump administration, Keith Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine, the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, possibly the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who still think, no, the U.S. cannot simply walk away or be seen as simply supporting Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. They have to have some role in working with Ukraine and Europe, given this Russian full-scale invasion is in its fourth year. Over the past week, because of some serious miscalculations by the Kremlin, that group has gained the upper hand. And that's one reason why, along with the role of Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, we have finally had the completion of the minerals deal.
So we're seeing Ukraine work with the officials that it can work with, as an example, Keith Kellogg, the special envoy, and possibly European officials as well, to get its side of this story in this war in which it's a main player out for Donald Trump's attention.
Absolutely. And again, to emphasize how the Kremlin, I think, made a serious mistake last week. If we had gone back only 8 days ago, there were U.S. officials staying away from talks with Ukraine and Europe. Secretary of State Marco Rubio refused to meet them, but Keith Kellogg did. And what happened is that the narrative moved away from a U.S. proposal, which was pretty much an ultimatum with many of the Kremlin's demands, to the idea of a 30-day ceasefire being promoted by Ukraine and by Europe. The next day after those London meetings, Russia launched a deadly attack with 70 missiles and 145 drones, killed 12 people in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. It injured 90. That was on a Thursday. Ukraine and Europe used that to say, look, Russia doesn't want a ceasefire. Russia just wants to continue the killing and to conquer Ukraine. And on the Saturday, 2 days after they put out that message, Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, got that 15-minute face-to-face with Donald Trump in the Basilica of the Vatican on the sidelines of Pope Francis's funeral. The photos of that were carefully arranged between the pro-Ukraine Americans and Ukraine and Europe to go out and to put out the idea that Trump was now beginning to hear Ukraine's side of the story. Well, here we are 5 days later, and we've got the minerals deal that Trump wants for his own interest and that Ukraine and Europe want as a way of bringing the U.S. into effectively a security guarantee without saying it for Ukraine against the Russian invasion.
Oh, it's extraordinary that so much rests on what it looks like random or calculated circumstantial events taking place. On this critical minerals deal, there's a lot that is vague and is possibly specifically and deliberately vague as well, because not a lot can be known. This is in the future, whether or not these minerals can be accessed and when they can be brought to market at scale and to really solve any bottlenecks in American minerals supply. So a great deal rests in the detail. Is this deal going to be holding long enough for any more progress to be made on peace in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I think you've actually summarized why the deal in a way is sort of symbolic rather than real. and that is it will take years before you can extract the rare earth minerals that will provide a lot of money for the fund, which is a 50-50 fund. So any idea of where the money is going is almost like in theory right now. The practical effect of the deal, however, is to open up the space in the meantime where Ukraine and Europe can say to American officials, including Trump, you have an interest now. You have an interest in working with Ukraine on its security because you really want these deposits. Do I think that this means the deal is going to lead to peace talks and negotiations? No, I don't, because that depends on the Kremlin. And the Kremlin does not want peace talks, as they reiterated this week, without their maximum demands, which is to split Ukraine and to bring down the Zelensky government. But does this deal, because of its symbolism, bring the Trump administration into the European and Ukrainian arrangements for security? As long as the pro-Ukraine officials are there in the Trump administration, they can handle Trump's chaos. And yes, they can give Washington a role in this.
A final question, Professor Lucas. What does Ukraine need to do to keep this space open, as you mentioned, so that it can keep its voice, so that it can stay a sovereign nation? Final question.
Well, it's not just Ukraine. I mean, it's actually Ukraine, it's Europe, it's other areas of the world, including Asia. It's the international community, because what you're talking about is a sovereign country that has been under attack, actually since 2014, but it's been under full-scale invasion now for more than 3 years by a neighbor, Russia, which is trying to split it up, which is trying to remove its leader, kill its leader, and which is killing civilians on a daily basis. So it's up to Ukraine to try to maintain resistance to that, but it's really up to the international community to continue to provide the economic, financial, and yes, military support to help Ukraine do that. Because if Russia was able to conquer Ukraine, this doesn't stop there. They can put pressure on other countries as well and say, look, if you don't do what we want, look at what we did to Kyiv. In other words, if you really want international order and security, you need to support Ukraine's fight to exist.
Thanks, Scott Lucas there, Professor of International Politics at University College Dublin.